Good afternoon, folks. Let me welcome you once again to Harvard Law School. My name is Charles Ogletree. I'm the Jesse Clemenco Professor of Law here and the founder and the executive director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. And we're very pleased to have back with us one of the great scholars and one of the true spokespersons for the issue of critical race theory. He's written a lot about it. Devon Carbado. I'll say a few words about him shortly. I wanted to announce, if you have not done that, I think Ernest Owens is here somewhere, he's in the back. So anyone who's not on our mailing list, make sure you check with him and give him your email address if you can. That way you'll automatically be notified of events coming up. Second, next Monday, the 1st of December, we'll have a guest speaker who is the daughter of one of our most distinguished graduates who's now deceased, Reginald Lewis. Her name is Christina Lewis, and she will be speaking on the book called Lonely at the Top about her father, an interview she conducted with a number of us. It's at noon next week. It will be probably here in the same room, but you can check on the website. The website, if you want to take it down, is very simple. It's www.charleshamiltonhouston.org. One word, charleshamiltonhouston.org. And all of our events are listed there as well, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for some of those events. For those of you who'd like to, this is the next to the last week of a class I'm teaching on the HBO series The Wire. I think some of you watched it. It's called Race and Justice, The Wire, and we have a class here in this very building today at 1:30. You'll have to find an open seat. It's 1:30 until 3. And we actually are having several of the actual actors who are in the Wire series, and they'll be talking about their roles as well as what they're doing now in their life. It's 1:30 until 3. And then next Monday, which is the 2nd of December 2013, at 1:30, and again, it's Washington B, basement 15, room 15. We're having David Simon. He wrote the books and created the series for The Corner, Homicide, and then, of course, The Wire. And he will be talking about The Wire and why he created it, what it's expected to show. And all of our events like this one is free and open to the public. We hope you'll be able to join us. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce a really noted scholar who's done an incredible job for us around the world. His name is Devon Carbado, our speaker today. He's received his bachelor's degree from UCLA and his law degree here in Harvard in 1994. He has been prolific in his scholarship, and I have to say that this book, above anything that he's written, is really a testament to what we face in the 21st century. And I'm getting several copies. I hope you will too as well. The books are available. The bookstore salesperson is here and will be outside selling copies of the book. And I think Devon will be able to sign them if you'd like. But it really is something that every son or daughter or niece or nephew and also grandpa and grandma should read, as well as a mother and father and aunts and uncles. It's a very compelling book that talks about what people face, and they don't talk about it a lot, but it's a reality in terms of what's going on and what's happening. He's won a lot of awards. He's been an outstanding scholar, outstanding speaker, and we could not be more pleased to have him here in late November to speak at Harvard Law School. Speaking on his book, the powerful book that you all know about, Acting White, Rethinking Race in a Post-Racial Era. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Devon Carbado.
So first, let me thank Professor Ogletree for that very generous introduction. It's entirely too kind, but I will take it, as it were. So thank you all very much for coming. I'm really looking forward to your collective comments, questions, and engagement. And I want to thank in advance Professor Ronald Sullivan and Lani Guinier, who will be serving as commentators. I'm sure that their commentary will be terrifically inspired. So I won't, in the context of this moment, reproduce the arguments precisely as they're set forth in the book. For one thing, that would create a disincentive for you to buy the book, and that wouldn't be a good thing. For another, what I thought I might do instead is contextualize the arguments in the book more broadly in a way that would allow me to get feedback on the current direction in which I'm taking the work. And the current direction is to ask a very basic question about anti-discrimination law, which is to say, what exactly is discrimination on the basis of race? It seems to me that all too often, particularly in the American anti-discrimination context, there's a huge contestation about how we should think about discrimination, meaning, should we frame discrimination as an implicit phenomenon? Should we frame it as a structural phenomenon? Should we think about it as an interpersonal dynamic or an institutional dynamic? You get the basic idea. While all of these questions are enormously important, they elide a more fundamental question which I think we should ask. What is race? In order for us to say something meaningful about discrimination on the basis of X, we need to have an account of what X is. X here is, of course, race. So what I want to do is articulate a conception of race that will function as a predicate for thinking about discrimination on the basis of race. Then I'll introduce a very simple model of discrimination, and in that context, introduce the actin race phenomenon. Then I'll stop talking about race for a minute and think about gender, because it seems to me that we can broaden our understanding of race by understanding the way in which courts approach questions of gender discrimination. And you'll note that that reverses the ordering of identities as they typically figure in anti-discrimination law. Is my mic not on? All right, sorry, let's... Can you hear now? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, do not be shy about telling me if you can't hear. So I'll say something about gender with the view that gender can actually help us better understand race discrimination. And it's gone again? Is that better or no? You sure you can hear it now? Yep, all right. So I want to think about gender, again, as a way to think about race. And typically, we do the reverse, which is to say, we think about race as a basis for thinking about gender. So I want to flip that ordering in the sense of suggesting that we might better understand how race discrimination works by looking at how courts approach questions of gender discrimination. So let's start with an analysis of race itself. So you've all heard the idea, presumably, that race is a social construction. Have you all heard that idea? So we might hold hands and say it together, race is a social construction. Nothing magically happens. So what finally is at stake with respect to that particular articulation? So I want to offer a model for thinking about the social construction of race that will help us broaden how discrimination on the basis of race is understood. And the first thing to note is that race isn't not yet there, which is to say, at some particular moment, race has to come into being as a basis for boundary work, social organization, differentiation. You get the idea. So scholars dispute when precisely this happens, but at some particular moment, race is cognizable to us as an identity category. So let's call that moment one. Moment two is the moment of racial categorization. So we're thinking now about the specific racial categories within which people are put. To say that there is this thing called race is not yet to determine what racial categories will be deemed cognizable. And for those of you who are interested in this particular dynamic, a study of the census reveals just how contingent racial categorization is. That is to say, a person in the census might be a mulatto in one moment, Negro in another. So the racial categories themselves shift over time, but black, white, and yellow are presumably three racial categories with which you are familiar. Moment three is the moment of racial assignment. So here we're thinking specifically about the criteria we employ to put people in relevant racial categories. So if I were to say to you, hey, I'm a white guy, you would say, no, maybe you're crazy. And the reason you would say that is because there are certain criteria that we use, including phenotype, to put people in the relevant racial boxes. Significantly for my purposes, phenotype and ancestry are not the only factors courts historically have employed to racially categorize people. If you look at cases across doctrinal contexts, across historical periods, you see courts drawing on, for example, accent, demeanor, the people to whom we are married, religion. Each of these factors are racially constitutive, meaning that courts have employed them to determine whether we're white, black, yellow, etc. All right, so let's now shift to, my mic is gone again. Let's now shift to thinking about the social meaning of race. And the social meaning of race simply is the various understandings of race that map onto the particular racial categories. So historically, for example, blackness has been associated with inferiority, whiteness with superiority, and yellowness with disloyalty. These are not the only social meanings that have mapped onto race, but presumably these are ones with which you're familiar. And we can think about the social meaning of race in another way. How many of you recognize these images? You recognize these? So where are they from? From Katrina. And you might recall the particular captions. A young man looting, and here, a resident finding. So two different social meanings about race. Now, if I were to flip the script, as it were, it takes more cognitive work for us to associate the black person with the finding and the white person with the looting, and that has precisely to do with the social meaning of race. So there are lots of different ways in which we can talk about the social meaning of race. My schematic just refers to three particular understandings that I don't think are particularly controversial. Moment 5 is the moment of racial experience. And you'll note that the racial experience relates to the social meaning of race. Concretely, if it's the case that you're inferior, then slavery becomes a possibility. If you're superior, then freedom becomes a possibility. If you're disloyal, then internment becomes a possibility. So you can see how the particular social understanding of race maps onto a particular racial experience. Finally, the confirmation of the social meaning. The basic idea here is, if you're enslaved, it must be because you're inferior. Why else would we enslave you? If you're interned, it must be because you're disloyal. You get the basic idea. So these are the dynamics that are at play with respect to the social construction of race. This is not the only way to talk about it clearly, but this helps to give the idea more legs, so that if we hold hands and we say the social construction of race, we at least have a more specific understanding of what we might be talking about. So let's move now from a discussion of race to a discussion of discrimination on the basis of that social category. So I've said that in thinking about what race might be, we pay attention to phenotype and we pay attention to ancestry. Not surprisingly then, when a decision maker takes ancestry or phenotype into account, we call that discrimination on the basis of race. So if someone says, I don't like you because of the color of your skin, we call that discrimination on the basis of race. And we call that discrimination on the basis of race because skin color is one of the bases that goes into constructing race to begin with. So if at the front end, phenotype matters with constructing race, at the back end, we say it's an axis along which racial discrimination occurs. Now, I've also said that geography, dress, accent, demeanor, all of these other factors go into making up race as well. So the basic point I want to make is that these other factors can operate as an axis along which racial discrimination occurs as well. So you get the basic relationship. If X thing goes into constructing race, then X thing can operate as an axis along which racial discrimination occurs. All right, so let's introduce now a simple model of discrimination that will take us to the acting race phenomenon and why we should pay attention to it. So the simple model of discrimination that I have in mind looks something like this. Racial identification triggers stereotypes. Stereotypes produce discrimination. We can make this slightly more concrete. The racial identification is black. The stereotype is criminality. The discrimination is racial profiling. I don't think I've said anything terribly controversial. You might say that's a rather limited way to think about discrimination, but certainly in the aftermath of what's going on in New York City with respect to stop and frisk, this should not be a controversial point, I hope. But let's make things a little more complicated and more controversial. Let's say that racial identification occurs in two distinct moments. Moment one, what is your primary identification? To which the answer is black, at least for me. The second question is, well, what is your racial salience? To put it another way, how black are you? I'm not inviting you to answer that question with respect to me, but it is a question that I think we should be asking, and that has tremendous significance for purposes of anti-discrimination law, as I will explain. So think again about why the question of racial salience might matter. The story I want to tell is that racial salience affects both the speed of the stereotype activation and its durability and stickiness, meaning the length of the activation of the stereotype. And these particular factors play a role in shaping how racially salient you are. So these factors, in other words, are not just relevant to the question, are you black? They're also relevant to the question, how black are you? And I want to suggest that that question is one that we should be thinking about, particularly in this context that we're calling post-racial America. All right, let's go on to Barack Obama for a minute. Well, it doesn't look exactly like that anymore. That's perhaps the first thing that we should note. But we should also note that in the context of his presidential run, there was absolutely no hesitation on the part of the media to talk about his racial salience. People were explicitly raising questions about how black, how white is he? And that was perhaps the first time that this issue emerged in the mainstream paper was, I think, in the context of Obama's presidential run. It became a subject of late night television as well.
With Barack Obama gearing up to run in 2008, pundits are saying that the United States could finally be ready for a black president. Here to comment are two former presidential candidates, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton.
Greetings, Seth and Amy. The age of a black president is indeed upon us.
Hallelujah.
Tonight, we want to talk to you personally, Mr. Barack Obama, because you see, in America, unfortunately, there are degrees of blackness.
Scales of soul.
Which is why we came up with this chart. It's our blackness scale, measuring degrees of blackness in the eyes of others.
I.e. white people.
Now, understand everyone and everything on this chart is unequivocally black.
But perhaps some are more black than others. Look at it this way. If these people were cars, they would be Oldsmobile, Cadillac, a tricked out Impala. But we all be cream in your coffee, straight black, with a shot of Hennessy.
But we are all delicious hot beverages. Now, now, please observe, Mr. Barack Obama, but there's only so much blackness the American voter can take. Now, if you're here with the black-eyed peas, then you'll be fine.
But once you get up into here, you're moving into Allen Iverson territory.
And that's unelectable. Now, Barack, at this point in time, you're right. At this point in time, you're right about here, above Will Smith, but just below Bill Clinton.
But this could change as the American people get to know you better. For example,
You were raised by a single mother and your grandparents.
Moving up.
In Hawaii,
Moving down.
you have an African name, Barack.
Moving up.
But in high school, you went by Barry.
Moving down.
You married a black woman.
Moving up.
But in the past, you dated white women.
Still moving up.
Okay, so it'd be a lot more fun to watch more of Saturday Night Live. I feel like I'm interrupting your pleasure, as it were. But this clip is enormously smart in the sense that it suggests that we should be thinking about race not simply in terms of phenotype, but in terms of a number of other aspects of identity. And we can certainly quarrel with whether the clip gets it right in terms of whether they move Barack Obama up and down the scale in precisely that way. But the bottom line point of the clip is that race is a performative identity and not just a static identity. And I think that's a really important point for us to have in mind. Gender, I think, is a way to drive home this particular point. So let me say something about this case involving Darlene Jesperson. It involves a sex discrimination claim that she brings, arguing that her employer engaged in sex discrimination by requiring her to groom herself in a particular way. And the specific grooming standards I've tried to capture here. You can see females are required to sort of tease their hair in a particular way. Men have grooming standards as well. And the response of the employer to the claim of discrimination is to say that we are requiring both men and women to groom themselves, so it's not a problem. The court adopted what it calls an equal burdens test and concludes at the end of the day that there is no sex discrimination precisely because, from the court's perspective, men and women are being asked to groom themselves. And if that's the case, you can't say that there is some asymmetry. Now, if I were to ask you how you might tell a story about discrimination vis-a-vis these particular grooming standards, is there a way that you might do so? If that's the grooming standards? How would you do so?
I said, do you know how long it takes to put on nail polish?
All right, so one argument, she said, do you know how long it takes to put on nail polish? So one way to contest this is to say that even if you're applying an equal burden standard, the standard for women is still harder, which is to say women are burdened more by these grooming standards than men. That's certainly one way to go at it. Is there another way that you can test this more fundamentally? Anything comes to mind? Yeah. Sorry? The price would be that. So that too would go to a challenge of the standard. Even assuming you have the right standard, you're getting the analysis wrong because it's going to cost women more. But what about a different standard? Yeah.
Someone who says, I don't feel as though I fit into either category.
You don't feel like?
I fit into a female or male category.
All right, so you could fundamentally ask a question about whether these particular choices inscribe gender in a particular way. To put this point another way still, men essentially are being asked to groom themselves in a way that comports with normative ideas about masculinity. Women are being required to groom themselves in a way that comports with normative ideas about femininity. We could say that that's sex discrimination. That's not an argument that carried the day in this case, but it did carry the day in another case. So this case involved Ann Hopkins. She's up for partnership. She's denied the partnership. And the record revealed that the partner said to her that if she walked more feminine, talked more feminine, wear makeup, this is a part of the record, people, expressly a part of the record, she might make partner the next year. And the employee wasn't being disingenuous. Hissing is right. The partners weren't being disingenuous, by the way. A woman was promoted to the partnership the year before. So it's not a moment in which they're saying, we don't want any woman. It's a moment in which they're saying, we want to think about what kind of woman we want in the workplace. And the court says that this is sex discrimination. It's sex discrimination because it's trading on stereotyping, A, and it's requiring women to be feminine, B, and that is a problem. So we can understand this case basically as saying something like the following. So we know that there are criteria that we employ to differentiate men from women, all of that in quotes, whether it's hair, reproductive capacity, dress, demeanor, and speech. But these very same criteria can be redeployed to differentiate among and between women so that this woman gets the partnership, but Ann Hopkins does not. Courts have said this is discrimination, notwithstanding the Jesperson case that I discussed, which is really something of an outlier. Price Waterhouse has dominated the literature on anti-discrimination law, so much so, in fact, that gays and lesbians who cannot bring sex discrimination claims by invoking gay and lesbian identity can bring sex discrimination claims, arguing that the employer is discriminated against them based on notions of masculinity and femininity. So again, Title VII does not cover sexual orientation discrimination, but because of the logic of this particular opinion, some gays and lesbians have been successful bringing anti-discrimination claims based on the notion that you cannot force people to be masculine or feminine, which is fundamentally what this case is about. So what I'm saying with respect to race is basically the same thing. So you have a bunch of factors that we employ, that courts have employed to make distinctions between between whites and blacks. Those same factors can be redeployed to make distinctions between people in the same group. So when we think about discrimination, we should think about it not just as an intergroup problem, we should think about it as an intragroup problem as well. And we get that idea perfectly well with respect to gender, but we're not quite there yet with respect to race, and that's what I'm asking that we should do. Now, this idea of intragroup differentiation is somewhat controversial. So think about it this way. There is a body of literature in the context of social psychology that goes something like this. If you want to debias people, so we all have implicit biases about race. Whether we want to or not, we could be avowedly anti-racist, doesn't matter. We have these implicit biases. Social psychologists have shown that there are ways in which we can debias people vis-a-vis those biases. And so what they've said is that Denzel Washington would be a good debiasing agent. Al Sharpton, not so much. Turns out that President Obama would be. Reverend Jesse Jackson, not so much. The Reverend Martin Luther King, yes. Malcolm X, not so much. So one can think about what an employer is to do with that information. So an anti-racist employer says, we know that there are biases in our workplace. We want to debias people around those biases. Let's hire the good debiasing agents. Is that something you want employers to do? Is that something they should do? So you can think about the hard normative questions that are raised by the intra-group differentiation problem that I am referencing. Two more points and then we'll stop. The performative dimension of race, or the intra-group differentiation problem, obtains in the context of conversations about criminal justice as well. So the ACLU's campaign against racial profiling in the late 90s, including this image. And the notion was that these guys were not supposed to be racially profiled. Recall the Skip Gates affair. The notion was that he wasn't supposed to be racially profiled. He's respectable, he's a professor. But these guys, well, they were supposed to be racially profiled. Or at least that's the logic. So if it's the case that the person who's racially profiled is not an innocent in the sense of being respectable or not being respectable, then we don't really have much sympathy for them. And it seems to me that we have to find a way to talk about people who are incarcerated so that our conversation about racial profiling cannot simply turn on intra-racial differentiation so that it's the Skip Gates or the respectable blacks and not people who are ultimately incarcerated. We can think about this in the context of affirmative action as well, and I'll say two things about this and stop. Affirmative action, as you know, is a controversial social policy. The dominant way in which we think about it is to say that it's a moment in which we're thinking of people of color, African Americans and Latinos especially, over and against whites. But here, too, people could be making intra-racial distinctions. And if you look at this particular profile of these particular applicants, and you can look as I talk, one can raise a question about how an admissions officer is likely to decide among Kimber, Jennifer, and Anissa with respect to deciding which one is going to deliver a particular diversity benefit. They're not in equipoise if what you want is people who are going to facilitate racial cooperation. Let's say that's the diversity benefit that you want, people who are going to facilitate racial cooperation. It's not clear that they're in equipoise. You might prefer one of them over the other. The final thing I want to say is when one thinks about acting race or acting white or acting black, the point is not there's some true way to act white or act black. That's not the point. It's just like there isn't any true way to act like a woman or act like a man. The purpose is that we are perceived to act out our identity, whether we intend to or not. So quite a point from whether I, today, am engaging in strategic behavior with respect to how you should read my race. The fact is that you're reading my race not just based on how I look, but how I am perceived to act. And that is an aspect of race that is not sufficiently on the anti-discrimination table. It is with respect to gender. It is with respect to sexual orientation. This is the sense in which race is somewhat conceptually behind where gender is, doctrinally behind where gender is. And this book is an effort to sort of, as it were, have race catch up. Having race catch up, I think, helps us manage the multiple problems of race that exist in a quote-unquote post-racial context. So thank you very much. I'll stop there and invite comments. Thanks. Oh, thanks.
So I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't have a performance to perform race. I do have a slight critique of what Devon is saying, but it's really slight because fundamentally I agree with him that we wear our race and people make judgments not just about our taste, but about all kinds of things with regard to how we look. On the other hand, within the race, and in this case within the black race, there are a number of subsets of racism that are going on that you can't simply attribute to black people. They are internalized to not only blacks, but blacks with money. So for example, or from the right country of origin. So one of the questions that I would have for Devon is, how do you explain the fact that when Harvard uses affirmative action, it disproportionately admits students who are either one or two generations American, meaning that their parents have come to the United States from another country and brought their offspring with them, and are not, therefore, the products of 2 centuries of slavery. They come with a lot of confidence. This is true also of West Indian or Caribbean immigrants, and I can say this with some authority since my father was one of them. And the difference is really strong, because there was a young woman named Aisha Haney who was from the South. So she was born in the South, her parents were born in the South, and she discovered that when she was walking along the Harvard campus, that people would stop her and say, "Oh, what's your name?" And she'd give them her name, and "Where are you from?" And she'd say, "North Carolina." And then their response is, "Where are you really from?" In other words, there were so many black people who were here from other countries that the people who were walking along campus were shocked to see an African-American black person who was born in the United States of parents who were living in the United States. Now, I think this is a pretty good example of what Devon is talking about, because the research shows that, for example, immigrants, blacks from either Africa or from the West Indies, tend to find jobs much more easily in the United States than blacks who are the children of other American blacks. And there's a sense in which those, and Devon is certainly among them in terms of being an immigrant, they come in with a lot more confidence about their capacity to excel. and they have not suffered all of the discrimination as they were growing up. So they come in with this confidence and with a sense that not that they own any right, but with a sense of themselves as being good people with good aspirations, a kind of self-confidence that many American blacks don't have. Now, the irony here is that this self-confidence doesn't last through many generations. In other words, if you are the person who immigrated, you will have self-confidence, and if you are possibly the first generation where you came with your parents, you will have a sense of confidence. But by the second generation, and there's work by Mary Waters and other sociologists, by the second generation, you have become just like other black people and don't feel that same confidence about why you're there or what you are prepared to do. So I just think that that's an important element in thinking about the work that race does in terms of communicating not only who you are to other people, but communicating who these other people think you are. The second point that I wanted to make has to do with a movie that I recommend, which is the 12 Years a Slave. And it's a gripping example of American slavery. It's the perfect antidote to Gone with the Wind, right, where all the slaves were very happy, and why did we even give up slavery? It was such a good solution to all our problems. But the reason I'm mentioning 12 Years a Slave is because it was so unusual to see the experience of slavery up front through the duration of this 2-hour movie. This was not just a cosmetic approach to the experience of one gentleman. This was about exposing American citizens, including African American citizens, to the harms of slavery. And I think that we haven't really done enough in this country. It's very different here than in South Africa in terms of apologizing for slavery and for the enduring consequences of slavery, which then I think become very important in the analysis, the very astute analysis of Devon in terms of the different ways that African Americans are interpreted simply by their names, by the color of their skin, the shade of their skin, whether they have quote unquote good hair. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which the appearance seems to determine the experience. Now, I want to end with two thoughts. One is the work of Mahzarin Banaji, who's a social psychologist here at Harvard, and who has found, using these tests to determine how biased people are, has found that black people are also experiencing the same kind of confusion about race as white people. It's not that, I mean, now I'm making up the figures because I don't remember them offhand, but what's important is the relationship between these figures. So white Americans, when given this racial literacy test, they score very high against blacks in favor of whites. But blacks, and here it's about 50-50, about 51% of blacks are biased against other blacks using her particular formulation. So that's an issue that I think is really important to emphasize. Perhaps I would suggest emphasizing it much more, because this is internalized racism that is affecting all of us. It's not just the way in which white people look at black people, it's the internalization of that way among many black people. And finally is this idea of racial literacy, that it's not enough, in my view, just to critique the experience that blacks and other people of color are subjected to, but to try to understand the work that race is doing in the society more generally, both in terms of how it affects the economy, how it affects people's opportunity to get into school, how it affects what's happening in terms of mass incarceration. And I say this in part because of a story that Beth Roy, who's a sociologist, writes in reviewing what happened at Central High School in Little Rock when it was being desegregated in the 1950s. And she examines this because she couldn't understand why the white people were so threatened by the possibility of 9 very well dressed. They definitely looked black, but they were appropriate for the occasion. And the white people just felt like this was, World War III, and they had to fight these young blacks or everything would die. Now, what is not known by most people in terms of what was happening at Little Rock is that the children of the white middle class were no longer in Central High School because the privileged had, in anticipation of desegregation, built their own new high school in another part of Little Rock. And so
Lani, sorry, just getting the screen out of your way.
Oh, right. Although it wasn't out of my way, it was probably out of all of your way.
The light in your eyes.
So in terms of what was happening in Little Rock, the doctors and the lawyers built their own school, opened it exactly the same time of the year that Central High School was being desegregated. And Beth Roy went and interviewed the students who were left in Central High School 30 years later to talk to them about their experience. And they were still furious. This is 30 years later. And they were furious because they kept saying that black people had stolen the American dream from them. And how had black people stolen the American dream from them? Because the presence of black people had led to the lack of presence of upper middle class white people. And so there are ways in which race as an identifier is still very, very important in terms of historical decisions that have been made in this country. And like what happened with affirmative action in the Fisher case, as well as what I just mentioned in the context of Little Rock, what Devon is talking about is really important because in Fisher, the University of Texas is denying that there's any discrimination against blacks, even though the black students consistently report ways in which they're being discriminated against, and discriminated against by having, ice being thrown out of a window on their head, having dormitories in Texas at the university that are hailing ex-Confederate soldiers. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which black people at the University of Texas are being exposed every day to pillars of hate. And yet it's very hard for the whites at the University of Texas to acknowledge this fact because they just see these as historical monuments and don't necessarily realize how important those monuments are to giving them a sense of power and privilege for being there. So I think Devon is really onto something here in terms of the way in which we read people by their race and make conclusions about those people based on that reading. So just the last point, to me then the solution, or at least one suggestion I would make, is we need more racial literacy in this country. And by racial literacy, I don't mean that you go to a meeting and sit next to the black person who is sitting by him or herself. I really am talking about racial literacy in the sense of understanding the role that race continues to play in this society, independent of the way in which many of us, whether we're white or black, think is horrific, but we do nothing about it. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Sullivan. I teach here at Harvard Law School as well. First, I'm only going to take a few minutes. Let me get a sense from the students. Do people have 1 o'clock classes? All right, so I'm going to take a very few minutes because then I'm sure you want to hear much more from Devon than I. But I'm the second responder, so I'll just phrase this in terms of a few sort of questions. I'll begin by saying Devon was my classmate here at Harvard Law School. Has been a friend for a very long time, godfather to my children. It's such a pleasure for us to be together here in this setting. He lives way too far away. Hopefully the Harvard Law School will change that in the near future, but it's good to have you here from California. So I'll pick up where Lani left off by talking about how important the work is. So this notion of race as performance has been under-theorized or not theorized at all. You've taken a series of conversations that I know black folk have had, and I assume white folk have had in terms of interactions in the workplace, and you've abstracted them, you've theorized them, and given us a lot to think about. A couple questions to throw out maybe to get the conversation started. So this notion of race as performance, the way we speak, the way we dress, the way we behave, move, all of these things are incredibly useful and haven't been spoken about. I wonder the degree to which in foregrounding those aspects, we lose sight in good old-fashioned phenotype as a proxy for all sorts of things. Race as a proxy for criminality, race as a proxy for all sorts of character traits that society deems as heritable. And that's a traditional way of thinking about race. When I heard Lani talking about immigration status, it reminded me of an article that you wrote years and years and years ago. And if I had known, I should have spoken to Lani before, I would have pulled it. But it was an article on the Fourth Amendment. And the article was a wonderful article. But the epilogue was really, really good. And you know what I'm talking about. When Devon first came to the United States from England for college, he and his cousins or brothers were driving around in a British convertible car in LA at nighttime, and were stopped by the police, surprise. And he didn't have these racial priors, didn't have any understanding of these racial priors. And he wrote in this epilogue that he had to learn, he and his cousins, brothers had to learn very quickly that there was a particularized racial script that he was supposed to follow, and he just didn't know the words to that script yet. And everybody was confused. They were confused, the police were confused, nobody was behaving as they were supposed to behave. And of course, you know, they have the firearm, so you learn the script fairly quickly. But you know, that was all color. They didn't get into anything, didn't care how you acted, how you spoke. As I recall, you wrote really confused them. They kind of said, you know, basically, where are you from? Where are you really from? Asked that question. But that was good old color as a proxy for you guys, young guys, up to no good. So the sort of question is, how do you weigh each aspect of the race as phenotype versus a race as performance? How do they interact together? Is one more weighty than the other? The second piece of that is a sort of thought piece, and this is why I wanted to chat about this. I wonder about these performative aspects as time goes on. And why? Because I'm the father of a 12-year-old and a 4-year-old. And some of these performative characteristics are melding in very interesting sorts of ways. All of these kids from all different sort of backgrounds just sound alike now, remarkably so. In terms of structure, they all overuse similes like, all the time. They dress alike. Their gait is very similar. And I wonder the degree to which these sorts of distinctions do the work that they do now, right? I have more to say about that, but I'm not going to say a lot. I also wanted to ask you about the use of salience in your work. So when you all get the book, you'll see that the book determines how racially salient people are, and salience seems to be defined on one end of the spectrum. So without going into too much detail, Devon, curious, I imagine that there are some people, so there are a series of hypotheticals in the book where Devon speculates as to what employers are thinking and what employees are thinking. As an African-American woman, am I going to come across as, and then fill in the stereotypes, angry or overly sensitive about race and so forth. And the employer is thinking the opposite. Well, is this person a black person who's going to be good in the workplace, or is this person who's going to complain too much in the workplace, and so forth? And oftentimes in making this, Devon calls it a double-blind choice here. In making a choice, a person's making a choice between being racially salient and not racially salient. I'm imagining that some people think, this is just who I am, and it may fall in one direction or the other. But to say I'm not racially salient if I don't, if my true inner feelings are not consistent with the particularized sorts of expression. You may mean nothing by it, particularly in terms of salience, but that word does a particular sort of work in the general lexicon, and I'm just curious as to what you mean by it. The second point is, that's actually not my phone.
I don't know if it's mine.
I don't know. Oh, is that yours?
It's not mine.
Okay.
Well, or maybe it is. Is it up there?
I don't know what it is. Oh, there's a telephone up here.
So it is mine. Just leave it.
All right.
Yeah, it's mine. Yeah, it's
Okay.
mine. I was trying to hide the fact. No.
All right. Last 2 points, very briefly. The legal intervention. Of course, I'm going to ask you. In the book, you said in terms of the ways in which respective views on stereotypes or media in the workplace is a thorny issue, and the courts are unlikely to get into it. And you gave us a roadmap how the courts might get into it. Just wonder what your thoughts are on how the courts could get into that, the harder aspect, because that makes up such a bulk of the book. And finally, on Barack Obama, who you used throughout the book in very useful ways to help us think about this issue of race. And here I'm going to pick up on something that Lani said, and we've talked about this before, but part of the initial, in my view, reaction to the president back in 2008 as not being black enough is what I refer to as his non-Negro status, in the way that Baldwin uses it. And so the performative aspects, no matter what he did performance-wise in 2008, there was a contingency of people who said because he was not a descendant of either the West African slave trade or Jim Crow America, then he doesn't have the shared lived experience of people, again, who Baldwin would call Negro, and that is the authentic black person in America, and there was an arm's length there. So here is another question about balancing how much work the performative aspects do versus other things, and here was just his ethnicity in the broadest sense of the term, and it's hard for people to remember back in 2008, but this was just a raging debate. How could he understand because his parents never experienced Jim Crow America and so forth. So those are the three topics I had, and to the extent that you would like to respond to any of them, we welcome that, but I'm sure that the audience has dozens and dozens of questions as well. So thank you, my friend. Come on up.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, sir. Good. So I know some of you have class, and so please do feel free to move about as you will. I will say just a couple of quick words, and then hopefully I can get some comments and questions from you who've been sitting very patiently. With respect to the first point that where Professor Guinier began, I think she's exactly right to invoke the admissions context as an arena in which one sees some of these interracial preferences. And I would simply say that I think that that is precisely part of the dynamic that I'm telling, with the caveat that I don't think that the story of ethnicity exhausts the performative dimensions of race, which is to say ethnicity is one axis along which intraracial differentiation occurs. It's not the only one. Class is another, but there are other ways in which we think about blackness that is not fully captured by issues of class and issues of ethnicity. With respect to the episode that Professor Sullivan reminded me of, and it's a very difficult moment to go back to, having those police encounters. For me, that was very much an Americanization experience, which is to say, one can think of racism as a naturalization process through which you become American. And there are different ways in which you experience that, right? So you might not be experiencing the racism, that's an Americanization process too, and you might be experiencing it, that's an Americanization process too. So I think of that as my Black American naturalization, which is not to say that I didn't experience racism in the UK. Believe me, I did. It takes different forms, and so the way that gets played out is quite differently. And in that moment of the police interaction, the performative dimensions, Professor Sullivan is right, there's a phenotypic initiation, the moment of the stop. The performative dimension comes in with respect to the expectation that I perform a certain kind of obedience. That is to say, that you enact your identity in a way that signals compliance, law-abidingness, and et cetera. The difficult question is figuring out the relationship between performance on the one hand and phenotype on the other, and I would never presume to tell a kind of total theory story about that in the sense of suggesting that performance is more important. I don't actually think that. I think that phenotype always does meaningful work, and I might actually concede that phenotype and ancestry remain the most significant aspects of race. And one of the interesting things, which I've not done but want to think about more empirically, is the relationship between phenotype and performance. So, for example, one could posit that the more stereotypically Black you appear to be, the more the expectation is that you perform a certain kind of identity. There's evidence suggesting that stereotypicality, for example, renders you more vulnerable to the death penalty. So you can think about what that means more generally. The more stereotypical you are, the stronger the stereotype about criminality, the more stereotypically Black you appear to be, the stronger the expectation that you perform your identity against those stereotypes. So those, I think, are all important questions for us to consider. One more point, and then I hope you'll ask some questions. So how many of you have seen the film 12 Years a Slave? So it's a remarkable film in many ways. There's one aspect of the film that I wonder a little bit about, and it's this. There's a way in which the film, to some extent, also trades on this idea of respectability in the following sense. So our protagonist is not supposed to be enslaved. It's a powerful imperative. That is to say, slavery is happening. It's not supposed to happen to him. And there's a way in which that does a tremendous amount of work in terms of the sympathy that it engenders on our part, which is not to say that it isn't a story about the horrors of slavery. Clearly it is, but the particular narrative thread about him being captured and put in where he wasn't supposed to be is another story about interracial differentiation in a way. So it's a wonderful film. You have to see it if you haven't, and I think it does open up a conversation about race. So I came to this topic by way of studying Nazi historiography, and it occurred to me that in that context there is this profound struggle with thinking about how you incorporate the Nazi past in a modern German identity. How do you think about the past that refuses to go away, as German historians say? And to my way of thinking, we haven't really struggled with our past that is similarly unmasterable. In some ways, this is an effort to sort of help us to do precisely that. This is a thin slice of the race problem. So this book is a thin slice. It doesn't get at the overall economic structures that we know are racialized. So I urge you to get the book, of course, but I don't present it as a complete answer to the race problem. My hope is that it will precisely facilitate the racial literacy problem that Lani has marked. So let me stop there and take questions and comments that you might have, if you have any. Yes?
I noticed that in your film, what was missing about women it seemed to be more important on how they dress versus what was attractive, what was their accomplishments in regards to the agendas of the board. I should imagine that regardless of race, that it's important if a female is coming up the ranks in an environment very male-oriented. Far more important is what are they accomplished, what are the track records, and what's their integrity.
Yeah, so clearly I will not argue with any of that. The problem is that there's a question about, the point is that in thinking about a person's ascendancy vis-a-vis the corporate ladder, that you're thinking about integrity, performance, etc., not how they dress. The point, of course, is that markers of dress have been gender inscribed, so that we associate who people are in terms of how they dress. I have one of my colleagues who tells me, she's not a colleague at UCLA, I'll say that, who says to me that every time she goes to faculty meeting and she knows she's going to engage in contestatory argumentation, she wears her makeup. Right. The notion is that she has more space to be angry when she's wearing her makeup. Now, you might think that's a terrible thing to enact, and to what extent does it then require women or create precedent for women to be palatable, to be angry? But the point is that it's not supposed to be about sartorial regimen. It's not supposed to be about makeup, but we know that these aspects of the self are constitutive, and there are lots of ways in which people write about the professional workplace and the ways in which those professional norms have historically been gendered and raised in ways that are disadvantaging. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. My concern about your schema is that the burden of proof of human worth is on the racial performer, right? It seems to me that we also need to ask, how racist is the racist, right? Not only how black or how white is the racial performer, but how racist is the racist in that encounter, right? Because I think what triggers a racial salience is racism itself, right? So I think about the genius of Dave Chappelle, right? In that skit where, when keeping it real goes wrong. And what he says is, he's in the workplace and he is acting his best white, right? And what triggers his most black is a racist encounter, right? When they decide to say, hey, what's up, I don't remember what the...
Show me some skin.
Yeah, show me some skin, right? And so what triggers that racial salience, right, of being more black is a moment of racism, right? So I guess my question is about, thinking about the burden of proof and how it seems to be only on the racial performer and not, these encounters with racism, like.
So that's very helpful. I think the point is precisely to think about how the racist acts, which is to say, I'm not first and foremost concerned with whether someone conceives of themselves as being racially salient. So this relates in some part to a comment that Professor Sullivan made, which is quite apart from whether individuals consciously conceive of themselves in this way or that way, is the fact that they're interpreted in this way or that way. So let's think back to the Dave Chappelle clip, because it's instructive. I almost showed it. I should have. So some of you have seen it. It's when keeping it real goes wrong. The point is that Dave Chappelle is in a corporate context. The narration begins with an account of him ascending the corporate hierarchy. He's the first one in his family to attend college, etc. But he always felt like he had to subordinate his identity to fit in, right? He felt like an Uncle Tom. And then there's a moment in the boardroom when one of his colleagues say, hey, show me some skin. And so there's a pause, right? So Chappelle could decide to keep it real or go along. He decides not to go along and, as it were, keep it real, and he loses his job. That's the basic idea. Now, you could focus on just him losing the job as the moment of racial concern, but we should also be concerned about the pressures for him to fit in. Up until that moment, he felt that he had to fit in. So we should ask ourselves questions about corporate culture. To what extent is it legitimate for corporate culture to require him to subordinate his identity? That's a part of the story as well. So I'm fundamentally interested in not whether people themselves conceive of themselves as racially salient or not, but whether others conceive of them as racially salient or not. So people are making racial judgments, in other words, not just based on the phenotype as racist, but based on the performance as racist. So it's consistent with the idea that you're trying to understand upon what basis is someone being a racist. And I'm saying that people can be racist not just based on the look, but on how people are perceived to act. Yeah.
Hi. So I have a question. So in Price Waterhouse, one of the main concerns is about the catch-22 aspect of it, how she made it to the top of the corporate ladder by not being feminine, by being kind of more aggressive and more like hyperactive in her job, and even though people thought she was abrasive, that was kind of her thing and kind of what got her there. And so the Supreme Court was concerned about how she would have to give up her edge in order to make it, and how that just didn't make sense. And so it must have been discrimination. And I just don't think that there will be, so I'm gonna work at a firm next year, and I don't think anyone's gonna be like, Sabrina, you should start showing up with an afro, or Sabrina, you should, like, do things to be more stereotypical. The push, the edge is going to be that I do things that will help me fit in better to the corporate culture. So I don't think there'll ever be a catch-22 aspect. So it's not as if it's really a Jesse Jackson versus Obama comparison. It's kind of like a Lil Wayne versus Obama comparison. No one's going to say, Sabrina, come in here and look more stereotypically black. They're going to say, come in here and look more, stereotypically what the law firm needs, and like we'll be able to argue that that's what the customers want. So I don't know how that maps on as easily with Price Waterhouse as what we heard.
Got it. So I don't want to disappoint you, Sabrina, but I fear I will. So you're right. The racial demand that will be imposed on you won't take precisely that form. But one of the things that you will have to negotiate in the context of corporate culture is, for example, do you serve on the diversity committee? There are going to be moments in which you are absolutely called upon to do racial work. Whether it's because the firm wants to trade on your racial identity, we have a number of black women. We need to be sure that our committees are staffed in a particular way vis-a-vis black women. So there are absolutely moments in which your race is going to be called upon to do work. It won't be the extreme form that you've articulated, but it will be that. And when you're called upon to do that work, the notion is you better not have too salient a racial identity. So there's an expectation on the one hand that you manifest your blackness, particularly vis-a-vis certain kinds of institutional work, again, but that it not become too salient so as to disrupt the corporate culture you describe. So there is absolutely a double-bind feature to how, as a general matter, people of color experience themselves within a corporate context. So I think it is there. With respect to Price Waterhouse specifically, there is absolutely a catch-22 that's a part of the logic of the court's opinion. The more general proposition of that case is fundamentally about gender stereotyping, and the extent to which gender-sex conformity is not something institutions can impose. And indeed, that's precisely the way in which the case has been picked up in subsequent case law. Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your presentation. I have, as an immigrant, as a Mexican immigrant, my experience was also that and I get this all the time, that I don't look Mexican, but that's another story. But the question that I have is the use of the words biased and discrimination as opposed to racist. And I had a very illuminating and painful conversation with a white friend of mine who said that not only whites are racist, but people of color are racist as well. It's something that concerns me, and I want to get a better understanding because I do a lot of anti-racist work, especially among Latinos. And there is a very appalling example right now happening in the Dominican Republic where Haitians or people that are from Haitian descent are actually invisibilized, and they are not citizens, even though they were born in the Dominican Republic and have lived their lives in the Dominican Republic and cannot go to school, cannot get a birth certificate or a passport because they are non-entities. And so that to me is an example of whatever term we want to use. So my question to all of us, and to you in particular, is, as people of color, are we racist or are we only biased? And if you can elaborate a little bit about the difference.
Yeah, so I think there's a huge literature on this particular point, which clearly, I shouldn't say clearly, is not really the subject of the book in the following sense. So this is somewhat of a punt. So my starting point for thinking about this particular project is simply to say that the law is an arena in which we say you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. The question then becomes, what does that mean? Now, there's a broader discourse about race and racism vis-a-vis bias. And I do worry a little bit, to be honest, about some of what social psychology has done in this particular context, which is to say, to introduce the word bias and implicit bias, which takes us away from structural accounts of race, so that we think that racism is fundamentally about some conduct that a particular individual did vis-a-vis someone else. That's how we think about it. Lots of people understand racism in that way as well. And I'm not sure that that's particularly helpful. I do think it's more useful to keep in mind structural dimensions of race, so that if we eliminated what we might call bias or interpersonal racism tomorrow, problems of racial inequality do not disappear because they're structuralized and reproduced in the systems that are currently in place. So when I think of racism, I think about it more structurally, and when I think of bias, I think of it more individually. That's a loose dichotomy that, if you push me, I would contest. But as a heuristic, I would simply offer that up as one way for managing the distinction that is not completely, I don't think, satisfying. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, Professor. I'm an LLM student from South Africa, and there was, we've spent a lot of time today looking at the construction between race and gender, and I was kind of wanting to narrow down a little bit the focus in terms of the intersectionality, specifically with race as it relates to sexual orientation. Earlier in the year, Mark Carson, an African-American male in New York, was subjected to a hate crime. He was punched in the head and subsequently died. And as a South African, one of the phenomena that we've recently seen is a procedure which has been dubbed coercive rape in South Africa, or corrective rape, whereby women who are, in fact, or imputed to be lesbians in township communities in South Africa are raped by up to 25 men in the hope that their sexual orientation will then be converted back to heterosexuality. It's become a widespread phenomenon. The government's done very little about it. And I was just wondering, in terms of the construction of your theory with respect to race, in your empirical research or otherwise, what is your belief about the agenda with race, specifically with respect to sexual orientation? Are some of the parallels that we've seen with the way that we're dealing with race sufficient in order to be able to try and solicit more sympathy towards what it means to be black, and more specifically what it means to be a black male in a society which is grappling with identities of gender and race? A separate issue, but a more nuanced issue which is required in dealing with secular orientation, which sits in between the two.
Got it. So there are several questions in that articulation. So the first thing I would say is that intersectionality is a really, really, one more time, really important concept that I don't know that we take seriously enough. So the performance theory of race that I articulate absolutely draws from intersectionality. So some of you might know that the genesis of intersectionality is a particular anti-discrimination problem that my colleague Kimberly Crenshaw identified that went something like this. Black women would bring claims of discrimination and assert that they experienced race discrimination, and the court would say, no, you didn't, because black men were promoted. Well, we experienced sex discrimination. No, you didn't, because white women were promoted. Well, we experienced discrimination on the basis of race and sex. No, you can't do that. That's too special. So they basically had no space to represent themselves. When they attempted to then bring sex discrimination claims under class certification, that is, they would represent a class of black men or a class of white women, court says you can't do that either. So there was simply no place for black women to juridically exist because of the ways in which white women and black men anchored how we think about sex discrimination. That's a really important insight, and it demonstrates just how intra-group dynamics can really be significant in shaping how we think about equality as a matter of social policy and as a matter of law. So what's happening now, I think, is that, at least in the American context, is race, sexual orientation, analysis goes something like this. Recently, some of you have probably seen the idea that gay is the new black. Anyone seen that particular articulation? So you can ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? I mean, it seems to suggest that a blackness as a social category is finished in terms of anti-racism, and that new attention ought to be paid to lesbian and gay identity. That particular articulation is clearly something we should problematize. On the other hand, within anti-racist discourse, it remains difficult to get questions of sexual orientation on the table in a robust way, precisely because we sort of essentialize race in ways that naturalizes heterosexuality, so that a gay and lesbian African American asserting a claim is understood to be something already other than race discrimination, which of course is deeply troubling. So part of the effort, I think, is to take seriously the idea that these identities are intersectional. And in the context of the book, we focus specifically on how performance conceptions of race build on intersectionality to shape black women's experience in the workplace. We have a chapter that focuses specifically on sexual orientation as well, to reveal the extent to which these identities are co-constitutive, and that we have to begin understanding them in that way, even if it's the case that sexual orientation as such does not occupy the kind of space in anti-discrimination law that we want. So it's an ongoing struggle. I don't know that I have an easy answer to the question, except to say that both then gay rights theorizing, it tends to focus on whites, and in the context of anti-racist politics, it tends to focus on straights. And we have to find a way to kind of push back against that. And your examples, more than anything else, demonstrates the dangers of eliding those differences. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It just brought up so many issues for him, so I'm just trying to ask my question really succinctly. So what you're talking about really happens in a system that includes how we are personally and on all the dimensions of our interactions. And so when you talk about performance, I think the best way I can do it is to talk about 12 Years a Slave. I so agree with you that it's about the exceptional person that is able to escape slavery, and that also the North is the promised land, and racism isn't happening up here. And so there's a way that it still plays as performance into the myth that we have, that, you know, David, we were just talking about, the myth that we have about what the slave economy meant for us as a nation. And so there's so many things I could talk about, but what I want to talk about is Sankofa, which Haile Gerima made years ago about slavery. Mm-hmm. And when I watched it years ago, I thought he...
How many of you have seen that film? Sankofa?
Sankofa. I thought he'd sort of made a mistake by making the white figures sort of like stick figures. But having seen 12 Years a Slave, I saw that it was very intentional, because it wasn't about the interaction. It was about how a community held itself together in a dehumanizing situation. And so I think here we're trying to humanize white people in terms of this system that's being maintained that we're all struggling with. And so my question about the performance is, how do we all sort of stand back and look at this play we're in together?
So the first thing you do is buy the book. No. No, I couldn't resist. You really did open that door. So look, I mean, I don't think there's any one way to engage in this project. I do think, though, that there has to be a recognition that part of the way in which we typically approach questions of race, which is to assume that invoking it is to cause racial division, controversy, et cetera. That's just the American starting point. That not mentioning race is the collegial thing to do, is the community building thing to do. I just think that we have to find a way to take that default or to shift that default so that the starting point is we need to talk about it, and then we struggle with how. And I don't have the precise answer to how. There are many ways to enact the how, but I think we have to disrupt the default to create space for different kinds of conversations. I think we have time for one more question, or are we done?
Yeah, one more.
One more question, and then we'll go. Sorry.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for bringing up gender, because I remember at one of my jobs where I was a therapist, I was told that it would be better if I wore skirts, and I wasn't really sure how that made me a better therapist. And the second thing I'm very interested in is I've worked in the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, and what strikes me is that more whites are incarcerated, but blacks are over-incarcerated by their percentages. And that seems like such a good point to do some civil rights work on, like making sure the educational systems in those programs are good, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, making sure they don't get in them in the first place, but being is that they are already in them. And I'm wondering, my sense in those facilities was that there was almost feeling that people were disappointed that those young black men had gotten there, and that they didn't deserve to be advocated for because they weren't being good black kids, if you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And then I saw sometimes the young black men feeling as if they get a good education, they were acting white. So I sort of saw on both sides a pressure from everybody for these young men to fail. And that was very sad for me to watch that and to try to fight against it as best I could, but I couldn't totally, of course. So how do you fight against racism when it's just sort of everywhere for young people that are more disenfranchised and not acting good, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so there is, as some of you might know, this broad literature in the context of education about acting white and whether that's a problem, whether that's causing what we might call the quote-unquote underperformance of African American youth. Happily, there's another literature that challenges that particular idea. I mean, the problem of the prison to pipeline, there are lots of different ways in which we talk about it, is not a problem that derives from African Americans disciplining other African Americans for acting white. I mean, that's just not the fundamental problem. That's A. And B, that particular phenomenon is a generalizable one, which is to say students across race discipline other students for overly identifying with education. That's just an adolescent phenomenon that we locate in the context of blackness to pathologize, to further pathologize black youth, rather than deal with the structural conditions under which they're experiencing education. So I would say that let's have a conversation about those structures. Let's think about the ways in which those structures are producing the kinds of pathologies that we locate in people, and let's think about how that conversation would then, I think, allow us to not simply ask questions about individual agency and responsibility solely, but broader questions about what we might do as a matter of social policy to disrupt some of the issues that I'm sure you confront in your work every day. So thank you all very much for coming again.